We're counting down the best films of 2014 here at Variety.com. I'm Scott Fondas, Chief Film Critic.
And I'm Justin Chang, Chief Film Critic. And Scott, we overlap on an altogether remarkable 5 of our 10 choices, which is an unusually high number, I would say. So let's go into our first film, which is Interstellar, Christopher Nolan's brilliant science fiction epic, which I'm very pleased to have on our lists. This is a film that sort of goes into realms that he hasn't gone into very much before in terms of emotion and scale. But I was just held by this film completely, and I think it just has more ideas per minute than most blockbusters do in their entirety.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in a year where there's been sort of a lot of heady movies about science and math and physics, The Imitation Game and The Theory of Everything. Interstellar is maybe the one that actually tries to explain some pretty complex scientific concepts to the audience and doesn't just have people scribbling on a chalkboard numbers and equations.
Christopher Nolan, he's got just one of the great procedural minds, I think, and he loves showing you how everything works. He likes to almost debunk, certain phenomena, and in this way, he sort of treats love and this idea of like love transcending, time and space, and treats it almost like a scientific concept that bears analysis. It was a really kind of transcendent experience.
Moving on to the next film that's on both of our lists, this is a movie that's also been much in the news recently, which is Selma, director Ava DuVernay's film about the civil rights movement, particularly the voting rights demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, led by Martin Luther King, who's brilliantly played in the film by the British actor David Oyelowo. And this was kind of a late arriving film into the whole end-of-year Oscar debate, and I think this is really the one that lived up to the hype.
I completely agree, and I think what's remarkable about the film, especially given just how kind of down to the wire they were going with it, in terms of the editing, is just how assured and beautifully controlled the filmmaking is. And it's so focused and intimate, and yet it captures this big picture of a very specific moment as well. You get these riveting action scenes on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and you also get really intimate, beautiful scenes with Oyelowo and Carmen Ejogo as his wife, Coretta Scott King.
Obviously, Martin Luther King's life is a subject that could never fit into one movie. It's too sprawling. But by focusing on this one episode and very intimate detail, you get a sense of the larger context of his life.
It's a really disciplined, really tightly honed piece of filmmaking. It's terrific. The next movie on our list is David Fincher's Gone Girl, which in a year filled with marital dramas, I think this was certainly the most indecently entertaining of the bunch. This is, of course, due to a very harmonious pairing, I think, of sensibilities in the novel and screenplay by Gillian Flynn, and the incredibly focused and just riveting direction of David Fincher. And it was a 2.5-hour movie that sailed by for me. I was, there was a certain point when I think I checked my watch to make sure that it wasn't going to end too soon, because it's just so controlled and so sickly funny, in addition to being quite gripping on a dramatic level.
Yeah, and it's funny, I thought about a parallel with another movie on my top 10 list, which is Laura Poitras's documentary Citizen 4 about Edward Snowden, because one of the sort of secondary themes of Gone Girl is the media circus and the way in which the media distorts reality and manipulates reality. And in a way, both of these movies are about people who are trapped inside a small place, their home, or in Snowden's case, a hotel room in Hong Kong, unable to leave because you have all of these cameras looming outside ready to attack. But I, just like you, found this moment by moment to be just an exhilarating cinematic experience. I think the sort of the synthesis of the story and then just what David Fincher does as a director, it's very, very exciting to watch. The way in which the narrative sort of dovetails into these two competing strands is really quite interesting.
Rosamund Pike is terrific in this movie, and she's getting a lot of attention for it, quite deserved, I would say. But I would also say, I think that, it just shows what a great actor Ben Affleck can be.
Absolutely.
I mean, he has definitely the less showy kind of role. Without doing very much at all, I think he just completely, inhabits this role.
I guess you could say our next movie is also a sort of sickly, perverse, and darkly funny thriller of sorts, which is Foxcatcher, a fact-based film by Bennett Miller, the director of Moneyball and Capote, about the real-life murder of the wrestler Dave Schultz by the Pennsylvania millionaire John DuPont, who's played in this kind of transformative performance by Steve Carell, a performance that's gotten a lot of attention. And I think actually this is another movie that had one of the great acting ensembles of the year, because it's really a movie in a way with 3 main characters, which is John DuPont, Dave Schultz and Mark Schultz, Channing Tatum and Mark Ruffalo, everybody is really on their A game.
I have to say, I think Channing Tatum, is the one who impressed me most. In many ways, it's just as transformative. He too wore some prosthetics, a little subtler than Steve Carell's nose, perhaps, but this is easily just the best performance Channing Tatum has given. He's just absolutely magnetic. He goes through this private hell where he's just completely unreachable for the whole film, and yet your heart just kind of breaks for him. And I think this movie confirms Bennett Miller as one of the subtlest and just smartest directors working in American movies right now. You're not even necessarily sure on a scene-by-scene basis where the film is going. It's very much allowing moods to develop. It lingers in these very dark and unsettling moods and atmospheres, but by the end you get kind of this full picture of a tragedy, and yet it's very darkly funny as well. The next film on our lists also won a big prize at Cannes. This is Winter Sleep, Nuri Bilge Ceylan's. This one is very much recognizably his and yet rather different. It's a very talky, long, kind of languid film about a hotel owner in Anatolia and his wife and his relationships with the locals. And I found this film to be just a completely absorbing experience. I just think it's so involving. The dialogue is so rich. The way he shoots faces, how he finds so much kind of emotion and feeling in the landscape of the human face. I just think this film is a challenging but completely rewarding experience.
This is really a movie that people have to seek out. It's probably not going to be playing in their neighborhood multiplex. It is a film that rewards the investment. I loved being in this world that Ceylan creates. I loved these characters. I felt like I was at a great evening of theater or wrapped up in like a great 19th century novel. I think that the people in it are very recognizably human, and the dramas that unfold between them, it's largely a film about class. On top of everything else, it's really visually ravishing film. Well, I think before we get to our number one films,
yes,
that we have to spend at least a moment talking about the number two film on your list, because I think it's the movie that we the most violently disagree about. And this is the British film Under the Skin, directed by Jonathan Glazer and starring Scarlett Johansson as a kind of alien prowling the streets of Glasgow, Scotland.
Luring young men to their doom and harvesting their bodies for some God knows what nefarious purpose.
Well, I almost lost my lunch when I saw you put it so high on your list.
I maintain, Scott Fonda, that you are going to like this film someday. So I think it has many of those qualities that you typically admire in films, which is, kind of not being beholden to kind of a conventional narrative, being very much a mood piece, about, kind of feelings and sensations that are just very hard to nail down, and just visually and musically, especially the score by Mika Levy, I think is brilliant. I just found this thing to be one of the most beautiful kind of aesthetic objects of the year, but clearly, it induced vomiting in you, so, it's to each his own, I would say.
Well, I guess that's probably a logical segue, because I think, my number one film is a film that some people probably feel that way about, which is Goodbye to Language by the kind of master ciné provocateur Jean-Luc Godard, the founding father of the French New Wave, who's still active into his 80s, and this is his first film in 3D. Amazing that he's still innovating this way, and I thought it was just simply one of the most exciting movies of this year, or really any year in recent memory, in terms of just the absolute incredible invention on screen, the ideas in the film, conveyed in a completely non-narrative, non-linear style with lots of visual invention.
It's kind of the most delightful headache you could have in a movie, I think. And I'm a big fan of this film, too. I think it just narrowly missed my own top 10. And for all the kind of imposing reputation that Godard can have, this movie is kind of a hoot. It's kind of delightful. The segue to my own number one, which is maybe not quite as innovative a film, but in its own way, quite a fascinating experiment, and I would say a perfectly, fully realized one, and that is, of course, Richard Linklater's Boyhood. Watching this film, I was just stunned that I had never seen this before, watching a young boy grow up on camera, and certain that I would never see anything like it again, and certainly nothing done so well. I wouldn't say that it feels seamless, because real life doesn't feel seamless, and that's probably the best compliment I can pay. You just feel completely pulled into these characters' lives, and it's just kind of a singular experience that I don't think I'm going to have again for a very long time.
I think the uncanny thing about it is, at the end of this movie, you almost feel like you've had a hand in raising this boy for 12 years. It's really the feeling that the film gives you. And I think Linklater has a wonderful eye for Americana, for sort of ordinary lives in the flyover state States. There's just a really unpretentious, unassuming quality to this film that actually has quite an unusual and very ambitious project behind it. It's also interesting to think of it in a way as a companion piece to Interstellar, because the first movie we talked about, because they both in different ways deal with the idea of time, the relationships between parents and children. That was definitely a constant in the films of 2014.
Exactly. Well, those are just some of our favorite films of 2014. You can read our full lists at Variety.com.